My name is Ken Davis. I'm the Dean of the Law School, and it's my privilege to welcome you today to our annual Kastenmeier Lecture, celebrating the career of our alumnus and our longtime Congressman, Robert Kastenmeier. It's my privilege today to turn the podium over to one of my colleagues who's going to lead off the program. Professor Frank Turkheimer, when he joined our faculty, brought with him a tremendous wealth of public service. He had been law clerk to Judge Edward Weinfeld in the Southern District of New York, assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District, and something I learned just preparing for today. It shows you it's always good to introduce your colleagues because you learn fresh things about them. Legal assistant to the Attorney General of Swaziland. He had also, which he just told me was the best job he ever had. I don't know if I'm going to steal some of his thunder, but I want to hear more down the road. He had also developed quite a reputation in the Watergate Special Prosecutor's Office and joined our faculty, where he's taught a rich variety of courses in the trial practice area, in the evidence area, and in a variety of other areas that are close to his heart, such as his occasional seminar on trials of the Holocaust. In that wonderful tradition that is the Wisconsin Law School's commitment to public service, I know when I came here in 1978, Turkheimer was only a legend to me because he had been appointed U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Wisconsin and was down there doing the U.S. Attorney thing. But fortunately, he rejoined our faculty and has been available to our students and our faculty ever since. And indeed, when he retired about earlier this year, he graciously agreed to continue to teach evidence and other courses and be an active member of our midst, so we're grateful for that. So if you would please join me in welcoming my colleague and friend, Professor Frank Turkheimer.
Thank you, Ken. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a wonderful privilege for me to be speaking here on the occasion of Bob Kastenmeier event. And I think you'll see what I mean as I get into my presentation just a little bit. What I propose to do is review for you the modern civil rights movement from what I think its inception until about 1963, when I had when I had contact with Bob Kastenmeier. And I must say, based on that contact, I was somewhat surprised when I came here in 1970 and in the ensuing years to find that, outstanding as his reputation was, it was principally in other areas in which he had excelled. And I hope that after I'm finished, you'll see why I was so surprised. I'd like to think that the civil rights movement began someday in 1619 when a Dutch vessel unloaded the first slave in the United States in Virginia. The modern civil rights movement can begin, it's really, there's no one place. You could begin it at Plessy versus Ferguson, when a group of committed and visionary blacks in Louisiana had a vision of the United States, which they put into litigation. Unfortunately, only 1 out of 9 Supreme Court justices agreed with them. So we had to wait a while. Jackie Robinson playing with the Brooklyn Dodgers was certainly a seminal event. Hubert Humphrey speaking to the Democratic Convention in 1948 and urging the party to come out from under the shadow of states' rights and into the bright sunshine of civil rights was certainly a momentous occasion. We have, of course, the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education, whose 50th anniversary we celebrated earlier this year. This is certainly nothing to be dogmatic about, I think that the modern civil rights movement really began in 1955. And there were 3 events then, and I think the first of them is the most significant. And I'm talking about the murder of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 15-year-old black living in Chicago who went down to Mississippi to visit his family. On the occasion of that visit, he was in a store, and there was a white woman behind the counter. And on the way out, this 15-year-old made a comment which would vary from somewhere being rather precocious to maybe slightly inappropriate, but it certainly isn't anything beyond that. Unfortunately, in the environment in which he made that statement, it was a capital offense. And the white community would not tolerate that kind of a statement made by a black or a young black to a white woman. And later that evening, he was abducted from the house where he was staying, and he was murdered, brutally murdered. Now, Emmett Till was not the first black person brutally murdered in the South. There had been hundreds and hundreds before. Why is this different? Well, I think there are three reasons. First, he was 15 years old. Second, and perhaps even more important, he wasn't from the South. He was from Chicago. And so his family could have a funeral, an open funeral, and not worry about ramifications or personal repercussions that might have been the case if such a funeral took place in Mississippi. And lastly, his mother, I think, had a certain PR vision which was extraordinary. She kept the coffin open. And as a result, the world was able to see this horribly beaten up face of this young boy prior to his having been killed. And 1955 is significant because, as maybe the students here may not appreciate, Columbus did not bring television to the United States. It was not until the early mid-1950s that a majority of American homes had television sets. And by virtue of that, and by virtue of the way this funeral was handled and other things relating to it, the horror of violence in the South was brought home with incredible vividness to American homes all over the country. Now, later that year, in 1955, we had Rosa Parks refusing to get off the front of the bus and the famous Montgomery bus boycott. And towards the very end of the year, a silent little thing happened which had great ramifications later on. The Interstate Commerce Commission ruled that there had to be integration of interstate commerce, interstate travel. Law matters. The next year saw many things happen. I think one of the principal ones was this heroic, gallant figure of one sole young woman going into the University of Alabama, Autherine Lucy, with the support of federal troops in the face of a jeering crowd, a threatening crowd, a nasty crowd, a horrible crowd. And once again, television brought that to all the homes in the United States. 1957 also saw the passage of the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. It was basically a voting rights law. It was, comparatively speaking, weak, but on the other hand, it was the first law that had been passed of that sort in 90 years. If one is interested in reading about that in great detail, Robert Cairo's third volume of his biography of Lyndon Johnson, the Master of the Senate, is a fabulous, fabulous story of the passage of that Civil Rights Act and how it got through without the veto of a Southern filibuster. 1957 also saw the homes of Reverend Shuttlesworth and King bombed in the South, so it was a violent year. What I'd like to do is take about 8 minutes and bring you up to 1963 rather than with my words describing what happened, but through a video, which is one of the many videos that have been made that cover that period.
People, especially students in predominantly black colleges, were inspired to move against the injustices they saw. In the winter of 1960, they began a series of sit-ins at segregated lunch counters in a dozen American cities that refused to serve African Americans.
Come on, get out of here.
We never gone down this road before, so there was some concern about what could happen, or what would happen.
A manager would come out and say, we're just not going to serve you, and you're best getting out because we're going to call the police.
Come on, boy, what you doing in here? Get out of here.
I mean, there was always the uncertainty of what would happen.
And you just stay there, and you keep your eyes on the prize. You feel the pain, but you don't become bitter. You don't become hostile. And you sort of lose yourself. You forget about your own circumstances, and you become involved in the circumstances of others. But we were committed to the philosophy and to the discipline of nonviolence.
In May of 1961, two groups left Washington by bus to call to the attention of the country violation of anti-discrimination laws in interstate travel.
These were all young, bright, attractive students, at peace with themselves. You know, I think every waking hour they knew they were subject to be killed.
In Virginia and the Carolinas, they suffered intimidation. But now they were entering the Deep South.
When we first heard that the Freedom Riders was coming through Alabama, of course, when they got to Anniston, the bus was surrounded, and while the bus was stopped, they punctured the tire. Then the Klansmen followed that bus when it left Anniston with those Freedom Riders on it. They knew those tires were going flat. And they set the bus on fire. The highway patrolman, if he had not been on that bus, everyone would have burned to death.
They were now informed that the riders of the second bus had been beaten by Klansmen in Birmingham. Proceeding from Birmingham, the riders had been assured protection to the Montgomery city limits by the state police.
I had arranged for about 32 highway patrol cars, 16 in front, 16 behind, with an aircraft following them from Birmingham to Montgomery.
And when we arrived, the patrol car disappeared. You just had the feeling that something was about to happen.
Go home, nigger!
It was a bloodbath. There was a ministerial student named James Work, badly beaten about the face. I think he lost several teeth.
And blood just came from everywhere. And it just started running down my face, back of my head. Our bodies became living witnesses to the cause of human dignity.
They would leave Alabama having survived the bus burnings in Anniston and the beatings in Birmingham and Montgomery. A few days later, they would be arrested and put in jail in Jackson, Mississippi. Hearing of the bravery that preceded them, blacks in Albany, Georgia, in Jackson, in Selma, Alabama, began to boycott, march, and protest. Even their leader, Martin Luther King, was arrested. It was Good Friday in Birmingham. he responded to white clergy criticizing him for going too far, too fast.
When you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, and your first name becomes nigger, your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stands, never quite knowing what to expect next, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait.
Okay. In this 1963, I graduated from law school. I studied for the bar exam. For those of you law students from Wisconsin, the bar exam is something one takes after graduating from law school to become admitted to the bar anywhere other than here. I finished the bar. I took the bar exam in late July, and I was to begin a clerkship in sometime in early mid-September. So I had about 5-6 weeks in between. I had seen, for the past in high school and college and law school, this and much, much more, and felt that I wanted to do something. So I ended up going to Washington on behalf of a relatively new group and a little bit not an established group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC for short. And I was basically a lobbyist for SNCC, unpaid, of course. And they had given me a number of tasks to work on, but one of them related to what would otherwise seem to be a fairly dry and arcane provision of the judicial code. Here's what was happening. SNCC people would be coming into the South to demonstrate, to sit in, and they would be arrested for trespass or disorderly conduct. Their conduct was perfectly lawful under the First Amendment, and bail would be required. They would post bail, and they'd get out, and they'd be rearrested, and bail would have to be posted again. And the problem was that all their money was being tied up in bail funds. In bail, every contribution, all the money they had was basically sitting in the treasuries of these municipalities in the South. Under the law, you can remove a case to federal court if there's a federal question. It's broadly stated. And they had a First Amendment defense to every one of these trespass and disorderly conduct charges, so they removed the cases to federal court. The problem was the judges. The judges, the federal district court judges, were appointed basically by the senators. The senators were part of the white, conservative, segregationist establishment, and by and large, they appointed judges of a similar nature. Now, there were exceptions. Judge Skelly Wright in Louisiana, Judge Frank Johnson in Alabama, and others whose names now escape me. But as a general rule, the federal district courts were hostile to the civil rights movement. The Fifth Circuit, on the other hand, was not. And back in those days, the Fifth Circuit, I think, included Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, basically, the Deep South. And the Fifth Circuit was a far less hostile environment. The problem was that when the judges remanded these cases to state court, there was no way to take an appeal. And so, as I say, something as dry and procedural as the ability to appeal a remand decision had enormous consequences for SNCC and the civil rights movement. And that was my job, to see about that. Well, I found out after just being in Washington for a day or so that the best civil rights bill on the floor of the House came from a young congressman from Wisconsin by the name of Kastenmeier. I mistakenly assumed initially that he had to have been from Milwaukee. I assumed he had to have a sizable black constituency, and very quickly discovered this was not the case. He came from what was then, is still to an extent, a rather rural district in Wisconsin that did not have a sizable black constituency at all. And so that his motivation in having this pioneer civil rights bill on the floor of the House was obviously not the product of an effort to cater to his electorate. I called his offices, and they said, come on by tomorrow. I came by the next day, and I didn't meet an administrative assistant or anyone else, But Bob was there, and I met Bob Kastenmeier. Now, mind you, I'm not even a constituent. I'm from New York City. He met me, and I basically told him not much different, basically what I've said here about the problems that SNCC was having with respect to its bail funds, and how if only remand decisions could be made appealable, things would be a lot better in this narrow area that was important to us. He said, you know, you've got a point. Let me look at it. I think I'll resubmit a new bill. And within a day or two, he had resubmitted his bill, and his new bill contained a provision which allowed for the appeal of remand decisions. I think the last thing I said to him was, I said, you know, I guess I should get somebody in the Senate to do something like this. And he said, why don't you try Senator Douglas? Paul Douglas from Illinois happened to have been one of my heroes, and I was delighted to call Senator Douglas's office. And to this day, I don't know whether Bob greased the way or not, but the very next day, I'm sitting there with Senator Douglas, going over the same story with him about how important it was that these remand decisions be appealable, and he introduced a Senate version of that later on. And it became law. The appealability of remand decisions became part of the judicial code the following year. What I'd like to do, it's going to take a minute to warm up. I'd like to show you some of the legislation that Bob Kastenmeier introduced during this period. I should have pushed the F5 sooner. So I don't waste time, to jump ahead a little bit. The essence of what this legislation is, as you'll see, is it's nitty-gritty stuff. It's not grandiose. It's designed, you just got me into this here. Okay, that's it, thank you. It's nitty-gritty stuff designed to be sure that the law works. Now, the first one was giving, you remember there was a voting rights law passed in 1957. He had a bill which gave the president the power to appoint federal officers to oversee voter enrollment and registration. Until this time, it was basically the Civil Rights Commission was involved, and it was rather cumbersome, and it took a while to get the voting registration process started. This provision, which he proposed in 1960, would streamline that, and as you can see, it was enacted in 1965. There was also a rather bureaucratic mechanism that was involved regarding the registration of voters. And if you read Cairo's book, you'll see that the compromises that had to be made to get the civil rights legislation passed in 1957 essentially entailed this kind of impediment to effective voter registration enforcement. And Bob's proposal in 1960 was designed to permit on-the-spot determinations, bypassing the bureaucracy. That too became part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The 1957 law only applied to federal elections. Just watching these videos, you can see it matters who is the police chief in town, who is the commissioner of public safety. Local elections are important for many, many purposes. And in 1963, Bob proposed that the voting right guarantees be applied not just to federal elections, but to state elections. The 1957 law prohibited a voting right test based on literacy. That was a fairly common way to keep black people from registering in the South. The problem was that it didn't eliminate other tests, such as character tests. And you can imagine if there's a white registrar sitting there wanting to be pretty sure that the voter rolls remain white, you can apply a character test with a fair amount of subjectivity and keep black people from registering to vote. The 1963 bill proposed was designed to eliminate any kind of voting test, and that too became part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Another problem with the 1957 law was that it required that an individual complaint be received to trigger it. In the hostile and in the violent environment, which I think you've seen a little bit of in the video, it was very difficult for a black person to publicly file a complaint. I mean, that would subject him to grave, grave personal risks, and his family or her family. And as a result, because a complaint was needed to trigger the registration process, it wasn't going as quickly as it could. Hence, Bob's proposal in 1963 to give the Attorney General the power to initiate these kinds of suits. And that too became part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then the last provision is the one that we just talked about, the appealability of remand decisions, proposed in 1963 and becoming law in 1964. Okay, now this all is, as I say, nitty-gritty stuff, and I think Bob took his role as a legislator to make sure that these things worked. But on occasion, on rare occasion, Bob addressed broader issues, and I'd like to end with that. But before we end with that, one last video.
It was Sunday morning. It was church. It was children.
It was 10:22 in the morning at the Birmingham 16th Street Baptist Church. A group of young girls had just finished their Sunday school lesson. They were changing into their choir robes.
The bodies and the partial clothing that you saw, it was like a nightmare.
They were not participants. They were not leaders. They were not marchers or sit-inners. They hadn't gone on a freedom ride. They were just there attending Sunday school.
The bomb that had killed the 4 children had been the work of the Ku Klux Klan. Until that moment, the majority of white people had never fully comprehended the magnitude of the intolerance and hate Black Americans faced in their struggle.
Shortly after the bombing of the church in Birmingham, Bob made a speech on the floor of the House. Certainly, those individuals who physically planted the dynamite that destroyed the lives of those 4 girls are guilty of criminal murder in the strictest sense. But in the broader sense, each and every one of us who has for years tolerated the 4 whites only signs that constitute an affront to the human dignity of civilized beings, who have witnessed the incessant humiliations to which Negroes around us have been subjected every day of their lives, each and every one of us is a party to that crime and must share in the guilt. Mr. Speaker, if this Congress enacts a truly meaningful civil rights bill, assuring Negroes full political equality, acceptance, and participation in the life of his community, then the message of the timely and dramatic parable which took place in Birmingham on September 15 will have reached the American conscience. If, on the other hand, this Congress fails to enact an effective civil rights bill, I submit then that these girls shall have died in vain. I hope you agree with me that in a career in Congress characterized by many brilliances, the brilliance of Bob Kastenmeier in civil rights has not been eclipsed. It's been a privilege to highlight this facet of his career, and it's been a pleasure to go back 41 years to recall my first encounter with him. And I don't think I need to say any more, but with that, let me introduce Bob Kastenmeier.
Thank you, Frank Turkheimer, for that very moving presentation to introduce us to the subject we're undertaking this afternoon. I, at the outset, would like to thank some people. I want to thank Peter Carstensen, professor, who is our connection, our faculty advisor, you might say, for this and other programs in this series. and Lynn Thompson and Theresa Doherty as well. They have, along with the law school, Dean Davis, they have provided a very gracious home for us for these lectures that go back to 1992. There have been, this is the 11th one, and I think in many respects could be the most meaningful one we have ever done. I'd like to introduce our main speaker. Roger Wilkins, as you perhaps know from the card in front of you, is the Robinson Professor of History and American Culture at George Mason University. He's the author of a number of books: Jefferson's Pillow, The Founding Fathers, and the Dilemma of Black Patriotism, and his own book on his own life called A Man's Life, his autobiography. He's a distinguished journalist and attorney. He was a member of the Washington Post editorial staff, where he shared in jointly in winning a Pulitzer Prize for Watergate coverage. He was an associate director, editor for the Washington Star, which doesn't exist anymore. Also was a columnist and member of the editorial board of the New York Times. Almost sort of reminds us of a recent lecturer here, Tony Lewis, who in a sense shared some of the same great attributes. He is incidentally a past chair of the Pulitzer Prize Board, and he served as an Assistant Attorney General of the United States Justice Department in the Johnson administration. Some months ago, I don't know just how long, maybe 4 or 5 months ago, Ronald Reagan, the late president, passed away. On the following couple of evenings, I think it was, the Lair News Hour, which is an hour that many of you perhaps are able to watch in the evening, typically had a series of commentators, of distinguished commentators, journalists, historians. They had Michael Beschloff, they had Haynes Johnson, and they had Roy Wilkins. Michael Beschloff and Haynes Johnson uttered a lot of niceties about the recently departed president, pleasant recollections. But Roger Wilkins, when they called on Roger Wilkins said, Ronald Reagan was a disaster for African Americans. He called the truth as it really was. I've never been prouder of a man I had previously admired than that evening, because he was expected to utter niceties, but he could not let that moment pass without telling the truth. So I am very pleased and proud to present to you, to introduce Roger Wilkins.
Thank you, Bob, for that overly generous introduction. I loved every word of it. I have to say that I feel very happy and comfortable here today. First, because unexpectedly there are some people in this room who have been very important to me in my life. There's my old friend and college classmate, Professor Crawford Young, with whom I shared many happy days as an undergraduate at the University of Michigan. There's your member of the Board of Visitors here, Lynn Sylvester, sitting there in her beautiful gray hair. I can't believe that she's old enough to be a member of your Board of Visitors, since I have known her since childhood and have loved her for many years. And it's nice to see her here. Then, to my surprise, up in the far corner is one of the truly greatest public servants I've ever known, a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, Doris Meissner, who was commissioner of the U.S. Immigration Service for 7 years under President Bill Clinton, a job that is about as hard as any job in the U.S. government, and it's wonderful to see her. And finally, of course, there is Bob Kastenmeier, who I will say initially only two things about. When I went to Washington in 1940, I'm not that old. 1962, my Uncle Roy, who was then head of the NAACP and who really didn't throw compliments around, said, there are 3 people in the Congress who you can trust at all times. Bob Kastenmeier of Wisconsin, Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, and Paul Douglas of Illinois. He was right on all 3 counts. And so I want to, before I even begin to say the other things I want to say, is my Uncle Roy, as usual, Bob, was right. I'm also really glad to be here at Wisconsin, as I'm a graduate of the University of Michigan's College of Literature, Science, and Arts, and also of its law school, both the schools that were implicated in the Grutter and Gatz cases that were decided by the Supreme Court last term. I am a fervent Michigan fan and a fervent Big Ten fan. But I have a sense about the Big Ten. I've always loved Wisconsin. I think if I hadn't gone to my state university, I probably would have come here across the lake. And so I think of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, where my parents went to school, as the good Big Ten. And it's us against the others. And the others, I would say, is mainly Ohio State. Now, I don't know how carefully you people follow these things, but I'm here to announce to you that your football team is undefeated. My football team is undefeated in the Big Ten. The 2 teams won't meet in Big Ten competition. If they both go undefeated, Wisconsin will go to the Rose Bowl because Michigan lost a football game to an Indiana school. And I'll tell you how much I love Wisconsin. I'll only be a little mad when Wisconsin goes to the Rose Bowl. I failed, when I was talking about people who mean a lot to me in this room, I failed to mention Bill Kaplan, sitting over here. Bill has been a friend for years. The most significant thing he did for me was to send me to the Soviet Union when it was still the Soviet Union. I've always wanted to thank you for that, Bill. I want to talk about the 64 Act as the definitive spike in segregation as we had known it in this country. It is hard now to convey to you what segregation was and what it felt like, but I'm going to try. from at least 1676, when the Virginians really understood that they had to divide their lower classes and conquer in order to retain control of the colony. They decided to stop importing white indentured servants who would then become landless and luckless white people, and instead make their entire bottom of the barrel labor force of black slaves. And they, from that moment on, in order to get the slaves to behave as they wanted, the colonists in Virginia, and then Maryland, and then throughout the South began a practice of disabling black people. And in slavery, it was a very raw, clear thing that they did. King Carter, who was the biggest slave owner in Virginia in 1700, would, every time he had a shipload of slaves come in, he would survey them and he would pick out the ones who seemed to be most independent, most intelligent, most likely to be leaders and perhaps rebels, and he would season them. That was his term, not mine. By lopping off a finger or a toe or an ear to demonstrate to this person and to all who saw what had happened and would see and hear about it that slaves had no will of their own, that their whole entire purpose was to serve the will of their masters. Disabling continued under the slave codes throughout the period of slavery up until 1865. Masters could beat, sometimes kill slaves. They could threaten them with breaking up their families. They could, under the codes, and did, require in many states that slaves not be taught to read and to write and to cipher, prevented from free association, certainly prevented from doing politics, prevented in many places from congregating together to practice religion. All of these were designed to disable the slaves and to make them fit only for the hard labor that they were brought here to perform. Now, after the Civil War and slavery was abolished, the disabling of blacks continued. The South took its revenge on the North by attempting to re-enslave blacks. And terrorism was the principal way to disable black people, as well as denying education. And the terrorism, the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the White Camellia, and other assorted improvisational night riders and killers and beaters. By the 20th century, the night riding subsided a bit, but the purpose of disabling was clearly stated, keeping blacks down was clearly stated by a United States Senator who rose in his full glory as a member of the august body, the Senate of the United States, in a seething rage because President Theodore Roosevelt had had Booker T. Washington to the White House for dinner. And Senator Benjamin R. Tillman of South Carolina said, "Now that President Roosevelt has done this, we will have to kill 3,000 niggers in order to keep them in their place." So the purpose of lynching was quite clear. You kill some people to keep all the rest of them in their place. Again, disabling, but as our society became more and more civilized, the 20th century version of disabling black people was segregation. I've heard white people, young white people say, oh yeah, segregation, back of the bus. That was such a tiny part of it. Segregation was an ocean to ocean, border to border shunning of black people, pushing us away and holding us down with the pure intention of keeping it firmly in our minds that we were so ugly, so dumb, so inept, such a drag on the society, and so closely descended from savages that we were not fit to partake in any of the good things in American life. Not political power, not decent jobs, not decent housing, no roles in the movies, no jobs on newspapers. In 1963, when Bob Kastenmeier was working on the Civil Rights Act of 1960, there wasn't a black person on American television, period. None. Zip. Zilch. Or as they say, nada. You could, if you were black, be insulted to your core by any white person who happened to be having a bad day. One day, when I was a student in Michigan, 3 student couples of us, my roommate and I and our black girlfriends, and my friend Sid Klaus, a mutual friend of Crawford's and mine, and his white girlfriend, all went off on to a picnic. But we left late. We were hungry. We couldn't make it to the place. We're all too hungry. So we stopped at a place outside of Ann Arbor. Not Georgia, this is Michigan. And it was a place where, it was a bowling alley and a place where food was served. And we went in and we sat for a long time. And if you're black and you realize these things because they happen, all of a sudden you just tighten up. If you could blush, you would blush. You don't know what to do with yourself. You'd like to disappear because you know what's happening. You don't know. You don't want to force the embarrassment. Sid didn't understand. So the 4 of us blacks were just sitting there paralyzed. Sid got up and he said, "Where's our food?" And they said in a loud voice, "We don't serve niggers and we don't serve nigger lovers in this place." And you never saw 6 American kids so defeated, so hurt, except these kids who were beaten. And we walked out, and the woman who would become my first wife and the mother of my 2 older children came out. She's from Cleveland, Ohio. She'd never been, she just sobbed. She couldn't stop sobbing. She just sobbed as if she was going to die. The segregation was even worse because it got into your soul. It seeped into your soul. No matter what your parents said to you, it made you think that you were inferior. It took away your self-confidence. It took away your willingness, because you believe in yourself, to take a leap, whether it was in commerce or whether it was in art or whatever, politics. It held you back. It kind of broke your spirit and broke your life. That's what segregation was, what it was like. Now, Professor Turkheimer has talked about the things that led up to the Civil Rights Act of '64. The Kennedys were not liberals. I went to work for John Kennedy, and Ted Kennedy is my friend. Ted is a liberal. But the Kennedys were not liberals. They were Bob and Jack were not liberals. They were centrists. Bob had worked, as you probably know, for Senator McCarthy. And their father was very close to Senator McCarthy. The Kennedys, even as late as 1961, really viewed civil rights as a political problem to be handled. They wanted to keep a hold on those deep Southern votes, the solid South. Bob Kennedy wanted the Freedom Riders to stop the Freedom Rides, and he wanted the demonstrators to stop their demonstrations. A political problem to be handled, whereas we blacks believed that we were involved in a moral crusade to vindicate the Constitution of the United States. And we thought that this was so critical because we thought that if we could align the three branches of the federal government with the fundamental principles of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, that the rest of America would be like Bob Kastenmeier and his group of liberals in the House, Don Edwards and Don Fraser and Harold Burton and Bill Fitzryan and some others, that the country would see like them, but we had to educate the president. And so some of us inside the government sent him memoranda, which we thought might get us fired. Some of us protested in other ways. Some of us marched, finally, on the Justice Department, our own Justice Department. We're in the government. We took leave to march against the government. John Kennedy began slowly but surely to see the South and to see these messages he was getting from inside his own government. And I think the film was right. He was deeply moved by Birmingham. He was also moved by the murder of Medgar Evers, the NAACP field secretary in Mississippi. The Kennedys were they were not very sanguine about the March on Washington in '63. They were afraid that it might degenerate into rioting. The Southerners in Congress were warning that black apes were going to be in town and telling their white secretaries to stay home and keep their doors locked that day. As the event turned out, it was like a church picnic. Everybody was just, if anybody here was there, it was calm. It was people were happy to see each other. The people started walking down the street before the leaders got there. The leaders had to come and catch up to lead the group. Kennedy, seeing that it was peaceful, that it was a huge event, late in the day sent word over that the permission for a meeting with him, which had been held in abeyance until he could see the lay of the land, said the leaders would be welcome to meet with him in the White House. And he was impressed with what had happened on the monument grounds, and he was impressed with what the leaders had to say. And then this horrific event, the Birmingham church bombing, occurred, and Kennedy sent the bill up. And shortly thereafter, he was murdered. Lyndon Johnson talked like a Southerner, looked like a Southerner, and to us Northern youngsters, he was bad news. But again, my Uncle Roy said, "You're wrong. I've worked with him. He's not like the Kennedys. The Kennedys were rich kids who didn't know any poverty. This man knows poverty. He knows poor people. He's worked with them. He's got it in his bones." Johnson turned the crusade for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into a memorial for our dead president, whom we were still mourning. And due to the stellar work of Bob Kastenmeier, who in those days of more comedy on Capitol Hill was very effective in pulling Republicans onto the side of the civil rights movement. I remember in June of 1964 demonstrating in front of the Capitol in support of the bill, and my then wife was pregnant. Very pregnant. Very, very pregnant. And it was a hot day, but she just was determined that she was going to march as well. The civil rights leaders were up there lobbying, and they came out and they joined our march, and my Uncle Roy looked and saw my wife in that state, and he said, "You shouldn't be here in that condition. It's too hot. You may have that baby right here." And she called back the best thing she ever said to him, "And won't he be proud where he was born?" In the event, she did have the baby a few days later in a Catholic hospital in Washington. And every night, over the hospital's loudspeaker, a Catholic clergyman from somewhere in the Washington area would deliver a prayer praying for the good spirits in the Congress to pass the Civil Rights Bill 1964. And I believe my time waiting for that baby in that hospital and then holding him while those prayers came through the air made me feel about as whole and about as optimistic about my country as I ever have been in my life. A few months later, weeks really, the first of the urban riots began. Harlem and Brooklyn, Rochester, New York, Philadelphia, Paterson, New Jersey. Black people rioted. People couldn't understand it. There's all this civil rights legislation. What people didn't understand was that millions of blacks had migrated from the South to the North in the years between 1940 and 1970. And sometime later, when I was in journalism, I was at a journalism conference, and somebody asked Tom Wicker, who was a very distinguished journalist for the New York Times, and was then associate editor of the New York of the paper. Wicker is a North Carolinian. And a person in the audience said, "Mr. Wicker, what's the biggest story that American journalism has missed in the time you've been a journalist?" He said, "Oh, that's easy. The great migration of blacks from the South to the North. We all missed it." Well, if the papers miss it, then the policymakers are going to miss it too. So these people came up looking for jobs. They overwhelmed the job creating capacities of the cities. They overwhelmed the housing creating capacities of the cities, the social service capacity, education capacities. And so though some of them progressed, the ones who were lucky and quick, many of them fell by the wayside, but they were human beings just like everybody else. They saw all this civil rights stuff on the TV. Their hopes got higher and higher in most of the states where they lived in the North. There were things on the books, laws on the books, that gave them the rights that Bob and his colleagues had to fight for blacks to get in the South. And so the ghettos exploded. And they exploded in 64 and 65 and 66 and 67, and finally again in 68 after Martin King was killed. Changed everything. Cities began to hollow out. White people became afraid of black people. The suburbs started to fill up. A backlash began first with George Wallace, well, first with Nixon's Southern strategy, but with George Wallace's runs for presidency, there got to be people who came to be called Reagan Democrats, that is, working class Northern whites who had voted previously for Democrats, now were voting for Republicans. Lyndon Johnson, overwhelmed by the war, declared a war on poverty and sent the money to Vietnam. And then Ronald Reagan nailed it. After a long period of right-wing demonizing of the black poor and of the liberals who would help them, said in one of his campaigns, in his amiable way, "Doesn't it upset you when you see a big black buck buying steaks at the checkout line with his food stamps?" Now, how many times do you all think that Ronald Reagan stood in a checkout line in a supermarket? Just about as many as George Herbert Walker Bush did, I expect. And then, of course, he talked about the welfare queen in her Cadillac. So in a sense, that he drove black people back, the poor blacks, back to the place where all of us had been in the time of segregation. Too ugly, too dumb, too lazy, too morally deficient to be associated with us or to be the objects of constructive public policy. So there became a national political consensus. This problem was both too hard to deal with politically, but too hard to deal with in terms of its intractability, and too hot to deal with in terms of the political peril. In a few days, I'm going to vote for John Kerry. And if I could, I'd vote 7 million times for John Kerry. I'm not saying this as a political statement, because there's a but that comes after it. And the but is that Mike McCurry, who is better at weaving words in a political situation, that if a guy can weave words through the Monica Lewinsky situation, he can weave words through anything. When he was asked the other day about why it was that Kerry needed Bill Clinton to come out to energize the black base, McCurry said, I almost quote this, "Well, there's a little reluctance there. You see, this campaign hasn't really talked about urban issues or poverty or things like that. And I guess now we need to go to their place and talk about their things." As I say, the problem is too hot. And blacks understand that our party didn't want to deal with our issues, but they want us there as long as it takes on Tuesday to put our votes on the line. Well, of course, if we got any sense, that's what we'll do. But we will not forget that today about 40% of black children live in poverty. Or that in Chicago and Washington and New York and other places, approximately 43% or so of adult black males are unemployable. I know as a former member of the school board of the District of Columbia, the hardest job I have ever had. I watched George Bush stand up there talking about, this is hard work, this is hard work. I yelled at the TV, you go sit on the DC school board, you learn what hard work is, sucker. But I know what is happening. I see those kids. I would go to those schools, and we are taking these kids and we're putting them into these dreadful schools that can't educate them, won't educate them. They go straight from those schools either to early pregnancy or to prison. It is a shame that in this country we're still doing that. So where are we? Some of us are so far better off that we can't believe it. Better off than we could ever have imagined. I thought the segregation was going to last for my whole lifetime. And yet, thanks to Kastenmeier and his friends, I've been very well employed in the years since 1964. My job as director of the Community Relations Service in the Department of Justice, as a program director at the Ford Foundation, as an editorial writer at the Washington Post, as a columnist at the New York Times, as associate editor of the Washington Star, and as a professor at George Mason University, are all really made possible because you guys passed that law. Because the Ford Foundation, Washington Post, and New York Times just didn't employ black people in the kinds of jobs that I was able to get after the law. George Mason University, it's a state university in Virginia. It would have been illegal for them to try to hire me before that law. So about 60% of the black population has really been lifted up and enlisted in the mainstream of American life. Sales clerks, bank tellers, telephone linemen, cable installers, professors at universities, professionals in city governments, elected officials, and even some CEOs, some rap multimillionaires, athletic heroes, and thank the Lord, Halle Berry. So now there are a lot of people, black and white, who are involved in aspects of the struggle, who are in a far better position to make a difference when the political situation becomes propitious. And when I say that we have finally integrated the 60%, about 60% of the black population, you ought to remember that in about 1960, 60% of the black population was in poverty. So we've changed. I want to conclude by saying that as a former member of the school board, as a person who tried to work on these problems at the Ford Foundation in the Department of Justice, and to see how we're destroying people, it makes my soul want to cry. But I believe in struggle, and I believe in change. 139 years ago, not too long really, my great-grandparents were still in slavery in Mississippi. The fact that I can say that here with love and pride in my spirit for them tells me that we have come a long way, because years ago I was ashamed of slavery, ashamed of that history. It reflects a powerful change, not just in my spirit, but in the spirits of millions of black Americans. And I think about the need for change, and I've heard young people even today, as I talk to after class, that I talk to, say, "Oh, well, but it's intractable. What can I do? What can I do? What can I do?" What I've learned in this business of struggle for greater decency in our country is that it's not a sprint. We thought so in the 60s. We thought by 1985 this will all be done. And so I got over the idea that it was a sprint. And I began to think of it as a long-distance run. The more I thought about that, and I thought about the heroes of our society, of our struggle, just the blacks. And I think of Harriet Tubman and W.E.B. Du Bois and Mary McLeod Bethune and Chief Justice Warren and Martin King and John Lewis, who you saw there, still in Congress, Bob, who was. I think people tend to say, well, I was there. I wish I could have been there with Martin or with Ms. Bethune or Miss Tubman. God, if I could have been there and helped her get those people out of slavery, I'd done that. And the answer is, they did what they were supposed to do when they were here. Now it's our turn to do what we're supposed to do while we're here. And in the end, two things give me great hope. First of all, that Bob Kastenmeier was not alone in advocating selflessly but on the ideals of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence for a fair and just society. I believe that there are more white Americans today who are willing to do those kinds of things that you did in the 60s than there were then. So that gives me hope. And for myself, and I would say to any black person who gets weary, or any white person who gets weary, a formulation that is something like this. I recalled my great-grandparents who lived long enough to become free people, semi-free in Mississippi, I guess. I have a sense that someday I'm going to meet not only those ancestors, but some ancestors of mine who never breathed a free breath in their lives. And they're probably going to ask me, well, boy, what did you do with your freedom? Well, now I think I've understood. It's not just a long distance run. When I think of Harriet Tubman and slavery and Du Bois 100 years ago and King 35 years ago and Kastenmeier, it's a long distance relay. And so what I need to be able to do to say to my ancestors is that I saw the poor people and I carried that baton for them for as long as I could and as far as I could. And in doing that, like my friend Bob Kastenmeier, I tried to live a good American life. Thank you very much.
Professor Wilkins, thank you so much for those very moving remarks. I think we were all really touched. Alas, one difference between your law school and ours is that its beautiful building still stands, where we had the bad sense to tear our beautiful old building down. But we kept a piece of it. And that piece is what we want to give you as a gift. We couldn't destroy that guy when we tore it down, so he's now the symbol of the law school. We call him the gargoyle. And I want you to have this to remember today.
Hey, Crawford, he's really a cute Wolverine.
And I also want to present one to Frank Turkheimer, who has spent his career walking in front of the real thing, and so now he has one for his desk. Professor Wilkins said he'd be willing to take some questions if there are some. So, Clark, how do you want to do this? Just
I'll stand up so I can. Well, I did have the mic. Okay.
Professor Wilkins, you ended by invoking the Declaration of Independence in the Constitution. And I'm very curious about your reflections, not about the Bill of Rights, not about the post-Civil War amendments, but about the Framers' Constitution and how that speaks to the situation of African Americans in the United States. How do you see that document from this distance?
Funny you should ask that. I wrote a book about that. We're all flawed, and we're all creatures of the culture into which we're born. I wrote about Washington, Mason, Madison, and Jefferson. And I didn't write about them till I was a little older than Washington was when he died. And I've seen and known presidents and important people, so I wasn't looking at marble monuments. And I judged them very differently, these men. I came away with amazed myself, came away with a just almost reverence for Washington, who I didn't really like much before. But essentially everything good that happened in this almost country then country in the last quarter of the 18th century hung on him. He went to the army in 75. By force of command, presence, and will, he kept it together. And the army was the revolution. And it was just a hideously long time, 1775 to 1781 at Yorktown. He then established the rule of the precedence of the civilian over the military by taking his sword back, his commission back to Congress in Annapolis. I mean, he could have become Caesar. The people would have been happy if he had, most of them. Then his reputation secure, he wanted to stay home on his farm, and Madison came and begged him to come to this Constitutional Convention, which would surely have failed just like the previous one failed had he not come. But because he came, everybody else sent their big guys, except Rhode Island. Well, what are you going to say? And then he presided, and they had these deep fissures, but they were afraid to break up and really act badly because they were scared of him, because he was sitting there staring at them. And so he made them come to some conclusion. Then when they couldn't figure out how to run the country, some people say, well, maybe we'll have a committee of 3. I say, well, that's crazy. Let's have one. No, if we have one person, he'll be a tyrant like George III. And they say, well, we'll give it to our George. He'll know what to do. And so he then went on to create the presidency. That's a lot of stuff. And he was the symbol of national unity at a time when the nation might have. And he learned that slavery was a bad thing. He was conflicted, as all of these men were, about it. Having no children, he was able to do something about it, and he did free his slaves in his will. And part of the way he learned because he was impressed by the valor of so many of his black soldiers in the Revolutionary War. Mason was very interesting. Mason was, among other things, he was Washington's tutor in politics. He was older, he was his neighbor, he was one of the most profound men in the colony. He was at the Constitutional Convention, he wouldn't sign it, wouldn't sign the Constitution. In part because it contained no Bill of Rights, but in part because over his very strenuous objections, the international slave trade was continued for 21 years in the Constitution. And he thought that was horrible. Now, he owned 90 or 100 slaves. He said that every master of slaves is a born petty tyrant. Jefferson took it a step further and said that every slave owner exercises his children in tyranny because they see what we do to the slaves and they start with us. So, but it was his wealth, Mason's wealth. He had 9 kids. He couldn't impoverish them, or didn't think he could. Jefferson was a self-indulgent, brilliant guy who I don't think much of. Everybody thinks that the title Jefferson's Pillow has to do with Sally Hemings, but I know that people in Wisconsin don't have low minds like that. Jefferson's Pillow is a metaphor. None of these 4 men could have been who he was without their slaves. They led lives that were cushioned by slavery. They had the leisure to do politics and write their great treatises and do all the other things they did because of the wealth and the leisure afforded to them by their slaves. So I thought of them as people cushioned by slavery, and Jefferson, in his autobiography, remembered his first memory was of being carried from one plantation to the other by a slave holding him on a pillow. And so that was my metaphor for these lives. You know, the most normal thing in the world is for people who have privileges to justify them as the most normal thing in the world. I look at all the stuff that they're saying about Kerry and Bush and Cheney, Bush and Cheney having ducked out of the military, and I think about myself. My war was the Korean War. And there was a draft, and we got deferments. As long as you were in a program, it led to a degree. The war started in the summer of my freshman year in college. We did a lot of bull sessions when I was in college. I do not remember one conversation, not a single one, in which any of us ever questioned the privilege that we had. So when I think of that, and think of the fact that I had evidence about poor guys that I knew who had gone to my high school, were just as smart as I was, but they had the money to go to the University of Michigan. They're dead. And I'm blithely going to English class. So what I say this. I love being an American, as hard as it is on my soul, because the country not only permits me to, but its ideals urge me to get into the most difficult and the most wonderful struggles human beings can be engaged in. If I'd been born in Zimbabwe or North Korea or any number of other wretched places, I could not live the life I've lived. And I couldn't live it here but for the fact that these people gathered up this cluster of Enlightenment values and put them into practice in a country that has constantly, some way or another, by a lurch from time to time, in a whole variety of ways, to make itself more humane and more decent. And I've had the privilege of participating in those struggles. It's made my life. So I understand those guys as flawed human beings, but as great human beings who did me a great favor, and I try to persuade my students in every class I teach that they've been done a great favor too.
I hesitate to ask this question after such an uplifting message, but because it's a downer a little bit. But I don't want to get too much in the current political situation because the election is just 4 days from now. But let me just talk about Florida. I mean, there's been we started off with a Voting Rights Act, and now there's a major effort politically went on in Florida, and neither political party, having to do with voter entitlement and checking at the polls, sometimes called vote suppression, whatever, and neither political party chose to make it an issue. And I wonder if we can view that as kind of a new thing, a new battleground, and almost a step backwards. And I think of it in terms of the Voting Rights Act and the movements in the 60s to guarantee the right to vote. I wonder if you want to comment on any of that, even so close to the election.
Well, I guess that I would start by saying that the suppression of minority voters has a long and honorable tradition, practiced early in his career by one of the most distinguished sons of the state, Bill Rehnquist in Arizona, who was a member of the Republicans' vote suppression squad down there before he was discovered by President Nixon and brought to Washington. There are a lot of people who, well, there are a lot of rotten people in this world, and there are a lot of cheaters. And we're in a bad patch now. I heard this morning that the Justice Department is sending 1,000 voting observers out around the country. Well, that gave me the chills. I mean, but yeah, that's a different frontier. It certainly requires us to figure out new ways to strengthen the Voting Rights Act and to enforce it. I suspect that unless we're very lucky, both Ohio and Florida will be very ugly Tuesday, and maybe some other states as well. One would hope that if that occurs, no matter what the outcome of the election, there will be a move to strengthen the act and to put into it real serious teeth that people could be put in jail for a long time for fooling with the elections. But there's another part of it. There are a lot of people, some of them even very decent people, who really do believe that people who can't read and can't write or don't do it very well and who can't be well informed shouldn't be able to vote. I guess I'll tell you a true story. I was the first black editorial writer at the New York Times. And I had a wonderful boss whom I loved, and I love his memory. There came time for the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act of 65 rather. And there was some move to remove the abolition or the prohibition of literacy tests from the bill. So, without even checking with the boss, I knew that this was a no-brainer. I wrote a firm, vigorous editorial saying hands off the literacy test prohibition. We need it. We ought to have it for a long time, and don't gut the act. To my amazement, my editor, John Oakes, who really was a decent, wonderful man, called me in. He said, Roger, he said, Abe and I, it was his deputy, Abe Raskin, Abe and I really don't believe that people who can't read should be permitted to vote. And that's been our policy here at the New York Times. I almost fainted. I mean, this was not the Anniston, Alabama Bugle. This is New York Times. So I didn't know my boss very well then. I wouldn't been there very long. Still feeling out the relationship. I had had white bosses, but he had never had a black employee before, so this is a little dicey. But finally I said to him, John, I'll tell you what. If you and Abe will publish an editorial that says that people who can't read and write don't need to pay taxes and don't need to go to war and don't need to send their kids to war, I will pull this editorial back. He looked at me. The next morning, my editorial ran without a change. No comma was changed. But there is a strain in this society that says, if you can't read and write, if you're not really literate and sophisticated, you shouldn't be able to vote. And I think that there are some people who are doing this vote suppression thing who really do think that somehow the Democrats went into every homeless shelter they could find and brought people in and also made names up. I also think that there is a lot of racism in it, and worse than that, I think there's just a lot of electoral criminality going on, and we got to have legislation to stop it. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Don't you have a wonderful opportunity with your background in journalism to look closer at the freedom of the press? Because I think that there have been a number of things, very, very bad things that have been happening that might be helped by a careful examination of what the responsibilities of the freedom of the press are.
I really don't do journalism anymore. It's, I mean, and there are all kinds of media centers, and there are all kinds of media experts at Harvard, at Pennsylvania, and independent media centers. There a lot of people who are much more attuned to that stuff than I am, and Ed Garvey said to me earlier, "Well, I'm now playing in the last quarter, and I got to get it right." Well, I'm in the last quarter too, and I'm going to do what the hell I want to do. I tell you that.
For timing reasons, we need to make that the last question. I know there are a couple of other people who can get a chance to ask, but Professor Wilkins will be around, and I'm sure that we can prevail upon him. There's a reception outside in the atrium. You are all cordially invited, and we'll see you there.